Um, yeah, so that was fun.
Whew, that like just literally just talking about it makes me sort of nervous. So,
well, nothing's gone wrong so far. So,
knock on wood, right?
Yeah.
So we've kind of talked about your process and gone, from the beginning planning stages to the deleting after you have moved the replacement. Can you tell me a little bit about kind of how you balance this against other projects, right? I think it's tough talking about tech debt, which we've talked about on the show before. And things like this where it's like back end work, right? It's not the front end sexy stuff. I think it can be harder to justify taking the time to do that. So kind of how do you balance this work against other new fun shiny things?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because like you said, it's not the sexy stuff, it's the stuff, it's back end, it's the stuff you don't particularly want to do but you have to do, right? So I kind of did it as I blocked myself out segments. So for example, I'm working on project A. I do that for 2-3 hours in a day. If I have a spare hour, for example, I jump back into this migration. An hour a day, it's 5 hours a week. Depending on how many process builders or flows you have, it depends on obviously how long you do that hour a day, but it's being really disciplined to do it, because it is really tough, because the project sat there and you're thinking, this is just cleanup and migration and change set deployment. It's all the stuff the admin has to do, but it's not the cool stuff. You're not building anything new and shiny for your end users. But it's also having the understanding of your stakeholders above you in terms of the hierarchy. So it's managing them for them to understand how important it is that you actually do this migration and this cleanup. But I think that's one of the biggest hurdles. If you've got them on side, then they will allow you to find that time to be able to do it.
Okay.
But for me, it was just scheduling, blocking out an hour in my calendar saying, do not disturb, flow migration. That's how I managed it.
I like it. And how did you you mentioned, you've kind of got this project, you've done the definition, but there's going to be other stuff potentially going on and new things coming in that might impact those flows, right? So I definitely can see the back and forth of, I don't want to build something the old way to then have to rebuild it, but I want to make sure it's factored into this new plan, and not just, go build it just for the sake of building. In flow, right? It's some standalone flow. I'm also going to have to refactor, right? So, just how did you kind of balance that new piece coming in while I've got the old stuff getting?
It's a really good question. Yeah, it's a really good question. So as I mentioned previously, the commission app that we built. So we built that, I'd say probably 4 or 5 weeks ago, and some of that work was touching our process builders that we still hadn't migrated to flow. So we had this battle, if you like. So what's the point in developing this in the current process builder? So what we decided to do, we did our analysis of the flow, looked at the dependencies. Okay, what risk is it going to be doing it as part of this particular release, as part of a commissioned release? And it turns out we just built that flow from the process builder as part of this commissions project.
Okay.
So we found we did have crossover, which again can be a challenge, because once you have that crossover, you need to understand the dependencies of the flows that you're crossing over. So it may not just be as simple as building one flow. You may have to think about coming back to subflows. If this process builder is calling multiple other flows, you may have to build that subflow as well as part of the crossover.
Right.
Yeah, it was a challenge, but we basically batched them in releases. So if we were doing our commissions project and we had a dependency where we had to update this process builder, we'd then go ahead and basically do the migration, but the commission stuff had to sit there.
Right.
Which again comes into stakeholder management. As long as your people above you are aware that this is happening
and the reasons, right? And then if priorities are shifting, then it's up to someone else to say, I need that sooner, so this kind of has to change. You mentioned risk analysis, and I'm just curious if you can give some insight into how you evaluate risk.
Yeah, of course. So it's determined so that there's risk and impact. So we at Elements, we measure our impact of change from organizational impact, regulatory impact, and architectural impact. So the data, for example. Anything that has a high impact on the org, for example. So let's give you a use case. So if I'm building a new flow, I'd deem that as and that flow is touching the contacts, the account, or the opportunity, for example. They're three of our key objects. If I do something in this flow that's going to upset end users who are using these objects across different time zones during the day when I'm potentially not sat at my desk and something breaks, I deem that as medium to high risk, right?
Okay.
Anything that's medium to high risk, I tend to develop in a sandbox. So I do it in a sandbox first. Anything that's low risk, so a low risk is really dangerous. So a low risk, an example of a dangerous low risk. So one of our account managers came to me and said, Jack, I need a new value on the opportunities closed on the opportunity stage field. That feels very low risk. You're just adding a pick list value.
Sure, that's a dangerous word, Jack.
Exactly. Yeah, that might just. Yeah. I did my dependency analysis, and it turned out the stage field on the opportunity was looking at, I think it was 6 flows, 5 process builders, a bunch of validation rules. So suddenly just changing this, adding this value becomes a bit more high risk. But anything that's deemed low risk, so be it a change to a page layout for a particular set of users, for example, I tend to do that in production. Now we're always a lot of admins are told do not make changes in production, but my feeling is if you do your dependency analysis up front, now again, I'm very lucky. I work for Elements who build a product that allows you to, measure impact and risk on metadata. So I'm in a fortunate position. But if you do that dependency analysis up front first, you should have full confidence in the metadata dependency that the change you're making, you're not going to break anything.
Right.
So anything medium to high, I'll do in a sandbox. Anything I deem low after my dependency analysis, I tend to do straight into production.
Interesting. And I think that could be very different too, depending on what your DevOps cycle looks like, right? So
definitely.
If you're, if you're using a tool for measuring that, then obviously you've got to keep all of your hubs in sync. That's not the right word, but so yeah, checking in changes and migrating them. So that may change a little bit, but I think that's really interesting. That I think it's easy as admins to fall into this advice that is like short, right? And never make changes in production is certainly one of them. I think in the past, one process to rule them all per object kind of became the sentence that we took away, right? Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting because I think it's easy for people to internalize those things and learn them, which is the point, but then you lose the why, right? And so what I've seen a lot of on these calls about migrating to Flow and, the future of Process Builder and Flow is people are, do I need one flow per object? And to me, it's really limited thinking. It's not showing that, again, why did we do that with Process Builder? Well, because we couldn't control the order of operations, right? We couldn't, there's various reasons why it made sense for Process Builder, which is probably why Process Builder didn't become the way, right? So with Flow, especially now that you can order your flows with a number, controlling with subflows, but subflows really maybe become more of that reusability piece as opposed to an order of operations piece. And so especially once you start getting into auto launch flows versus record triggered flows versus having screens, right? You're not going to get even a record triggered before save after save, right? You're not going to get to just one flow project probably. And so it's more about understanding, like you said, the dependencies of what needs to happen if you've got 8 flows in that chain, right? And just really understanding you don't want everything to update all the time, right? Like, and the concepts about recursion and the time to save to DML operations, etc. Right?
The DML that's been a real challenge for us is DML operations. Yeah, because it's part of our design when we're designing a flow. Because we have flows that loop several records, and then those records get updated, and that causes the DML sometimes to crash because you hit the DML limits. Which is where this is where we started to use platform events, because it's doing it once. It's doing it one time rather than then having to loop through and update them every time we hit DML operators. But yeah, DML was really interesting. But again, we cover that as part of our design before we build the flow.
And I do think another kind of key difference with flow is the errors and catching and handling. I think that's a different mindset. Interesting, also potentially a good use of a subflow to have a consistent experience there. But how did that kind of change? You've mentioned kind of, it's tough to triage and test flow.
Yep.
Do you have any recommendations on that? Because I feel like that's not more of an advanced exactly, but it's easy to build a flow and not do that, right? And assume that happy path. And so, how have you kind of handled that handling?
So we're really guilty of this. And funnily enough, it's actually the project I'm working on at the moment is fault handling in flows. Because we were very reliant on the flow error that came through the email. So create opportunity had error flow, for example, and you get all of the debug log through your inbox. But the problem we found is it's what the end users see as well. When they hit a flow error, they don't actually see the error. They just see a load of red writing saying this has gone to your system admin. It'd be nice to actually be able to tell the end user what's happened and that the system admin is looking at it, and we have a case ID, for example. So the process we're going down is very much using the error handling and flow to create a case. We're going to manage them using cases, and we're going to send the end user a nice shiny, oh no, this is broken, this is the case, and you can track it through. Yeah.
Interesting. And you did a presentation, I think, on Automation Hour about flows to track your flows. Did I get that right?
Yeah, correct. We built we had a bit of a hole, a pain, if you like, where we weren't sure when our process builders and flows were actually running, and we wanted to manage it from an adoption point of view, because we were putting a lot of time into building some fairly complex flows around CPQ. But are they actually being used? So yeah, we built a really, I think it was two custom objects maybe, and we used to in every flow or process builder where we wanted to track, we used the subflow element to create a process builder log item, and then we could report on metrics on what's being used, what users using it, how often it's being used. So yeah, that's an automation hour. Yeah,
well, I'll link to that. I mean, I tuned into it, but I'll watch it again. So you've definitely shared some great insights. And out of curiosity, are you building all these things yourself for your
no
small to medium size org, which probably has, it sounds like, medium complexity of things?
Yeah, no, it's not just, I was doing it by myself for probably 3 years. With help from Adrian, who's our CTO. But we've recently taken on a junior admin called Rory. He's been with us for 3 months. He's doing a really good job. He was the one that built the vast majority of flows from Process Builder. We kind of gave it to him almost as a training exercise. Here's flow. This is what you need to migrate from Process Builder. He was part of all the analysis and the design, and he did a great job of building them all over.
Well, that's a good example.
So I'm not by myself anymore.
Well, that's great, but also a good example of somebody new, maybe with junior admin level skills, kind of coming in and being able to pick things up and learn. I think is a great.
it was in a sandbox. You can't break anything.
Right. It can only go so badly for you.
Exactly. Yeah.
So along the way with this process, do you have any recommendations for somebody, maybe like me, maybe not me, that, is about to get started, and kind of some lessons learned that might be helpful for them?
I think the biggest takeaway we have was the naming convention.
Okay.
So when we're building, we should have taken more care around what we were naming our flows, because back to the beginning of the recording, we said about the future self. In 6 months' time, you want to be able to access the flow and know exactly what it does purely from the label. Because what we found is we spent a lot of time fishing around and going into flows. Oh no, it's not that one we need, because our naming convention just wasn't good enough. So that would be my one recommendation when you're starting off, is think about naming convention before you dive in, I think.
And there's definitely some great recommendations out there on the SFXD Discord wiki. There's a document, I believe. Of course, I can't think of people's names when I'm trying to ad lib on the fly. There's definitely recommendations out there about naming conventions. I don't think that I bring that up because I don't think there's any one right answer, right?
No,
so something that makes sense for you. I know when I started, I have another integration, and I just made up like an abbreviation and a number so that I could track, actually, so I could tag fields and elements that were used in those automations. So whether it's, an RT for record triggered versus AL for auto launch versus, really just getting in a pattern of object name, some details. And again, to your point, the name and or the description really helping future not you, understand what the flow is trying to do, and any kind of key dependencies you may have there.
Agreed.
When you started to learn flow, did you kind of just dig in? I know you mentioned Trailhead before. Is there any other resources that you recommend?
It's Trailhead. I was also reading a lot of Jen Lee, her blog online. That really helped. YouTube videos. Again, coming back to my current role, I'm very lucky in that. Again, I've got the environment and people around me that have got 20 plus years in experience around programming and Salesforce, etc. So I was lucky to fall into that environment. But I'd say Trailhead's really good. Jen Lee's blog I found really helpful. And also the Slack Ohana, really good as well for help.
Very nice. Yeah. Well, and there's now a Salesforce break Slack, which is Andy, as I butchered his last name earlier, blog. And he started a Slack with, specific flow channels, which can be really helpful as well. A few other things I wanted to mention that I'm pursuing and or referring, as this, again, conversation comes up every Salesforce Saturday, every user group meeting, pretty much. There are paid courses if that's something that you're interested in. Melody from Salesforce Flowsum just did a review or is adding to reviews of those courses. So I think that's a great kind of like an expert that is also kind of helping you understand which options might be helpful for you. And Andy and Terry Miller are doing Flow office hours. So I believe it's the second Friday of the month, and we'll link to that. So, you want to make sure you bring kind of concise questions. You're not going to just design your whole flow in the call, right? But if you're stuck somewhere, I think those can be great options. And of course, we mentioned, there's people out there that are interested and to help you, right? It was great to see. I don't know if you caught Flow Fest recently, but the competition was one thing, right? They had competitors that built flows in a timed manner, and but it was interesting. They also had the judges pop in to kind of talk about different items about flow, and it's just really interesting to see different faces and different people who have just kind of figured it out and are turning around to help others. So there's help out there, really cool, but also don't be afraid. Maybe that's
the thing.
Just do
Don't
it
be
is our
afraid.
tagline.
Yeah, definitely.
And we'll also link to some of the takeaways and items that you've mentioned. You also partnered to feature on your blog for Elements. So we'll link to that too, of some of this idea of really refactoring versus considering it as a migration, I think can be really helpful to admins who are in this position of slight panic. Thank you so much, Jack, for joining me. Before I let you go, I know you've been had a lot going on in your blocking time off in your calendar, but when you take an add minute for yourself to learn some new things, what's something you would recommend for our listeners to check out?
Cool. So part of my role, a lot of it is around stakeholder management and talking to people and understanding their business needs and how we can then obviously translate that into IT systems. And stakeholder management is it's a tough skill to learn, and you're still going to be learning it all the time. So at the moment, it's part of my chill down time, if you like. I'm reading a book called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. It was actually recommended to me by a colleague. It's written by a former FBI hostage negotiator. So it's a bit left field. But it's how he brings high-stake negotiations. He brings it into a business context and also into an everyday life context. So it's negotiating as if your life depended on it. But it's understanding, how to engage with different types of people, asking the right questions, and getting a feeling of the atmosphere in the room, if you like, when you're asking these questions. But it can help you with stakeholder management. It can help you with, I made a joke before the recording, negotiating with your wife or partner what you're going to have for dinner if you don't want what they're cooking. It can help you in a business context, from negotiating salary increases, showing interest in new roles, for example. So yeah, that's what I'm reading at the moment. But a bit left field with the hostage negotiation, but it does bring it into a business.
It's interesting to think about how it ties into your daily life for work and for home, right? I took a much easier approach in making a recommendation of a great blog I saw on the official Salesforce admin blog, 5 new videos to help you understand tricky flow concepts. And one of the reasons I really liked it was because it's not just words, right? They've got videos talking you through some of those kind of key concepts. And like I said, I get into analysis paralysis phase and get to worry about the pieces that I don't know. And so this was a great kind of breakdown of some of the flow concepts that you may not use as often. So getting comfortable with those. So that will be helpful on my journey to be like Jack and get my automations documented and moved over into flow. Well, thanks so much, Jack, for joining us, and good luck with migrating the rest of your flows.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.